Chapter 2. Crisis of Confusion. Zack didn't stop to think about the consequences of his actions, or what it would mean to himself. If he were perfectly honest, he'd say he didn't think at all. One moment he was all the way across the clearing, watching the infantryman fall back into the pool of Mako, and the next he was right beside it, scouring it for any sign of the guy. The spring must have been deeper than it looked to swallow him up the way it had. Or maybe it had done just that, swallowed him up. Then Zack swore he saw the eerie surface of the pool shift, just a little. It was enough for him, and he stepped out into the shallows of the pool. It sizzled against the thick soles of his boots, and then lapped around his ankles. He'd never been more glad for the thick sturdiness of the military-issue footwear before. One Mako bath in his lifetime was more than enough for him. "Come on," he muttered to himself. Then, just there, he saw it. A sliver of shadow and colour. Zack leaned forward and reached out until his gloved hand slid beneath the thick surface of the Mako. Almost immediately he felt a responding hand grasp his. He barely noticed the searing pain of Mako on his forearm as he yanked the unresisting body towards him and hauled the trooper out of the pool as quickly as he could. A film of green slime sluiced over them, and droplets of Mako rained from the trooper's clothes as he scrambled woozily. Zack released his hand to grab him under the arms and drag him for the rest of the way free of the pool. He didn't care that he was getting Mako all over his bare arms, or his shirt, or even the bit burning oddly cold, yet hot against his cheek. He was a soldier. He could deal with a little Mako. Zack fumbled slightly as he yanked off the trooper's helmet to reveal a head of wild blonde hair and a pair of hazy blue eyes. Even as his mind noted the blonde pupils looked unfocused, something that probably wasn't good, Zack recognized the kid. "What? Cloud! I didn't even know you were with us." The last part was half muttered to himself. He couldn't help but think the trooper was giving him an odd look, though that was probably just from his recent Mako dousing. In an attempt to keep him from panicking, as well as keep his attention, Zack said, "Is it my hair? I know it's a little weird. My girlfriend laughed at me, you know." "How are you feeling?" If he could get some sort of response, it would probably be a good idea to get him out of those Mako-soaked clothes. Cloud's only response was a Zack thought it was better than nothing, and gave his shoulder an encouraging squeeze. "That's the spirit, just..." Zack was interrupted by a sudden terrified scream that cut off abruptly in a death gurgle, followed by a round of gunfire. Something feral shrieked, then echoed by another. It sounded like there was more than one hippogriff in these woods. He glanced towards where he'd left Buster Sword, and gripped Cloud's upper arm. "You hang on for me, okay? This is going to get rough." Zack was once more interrupted as Cloud suddenly jerked in his hold. Cloud's hand scrambled frantically against his chest and arms, his body twisting as he fought to get himself to his feet. Zack surged up with him, afraid that Cloud would injure himself, and slid a hand under Cloud's arm to steady him. "Whoa, take it easy." His head was spinning, and he knew he had to get things under control as quickly as possible. For a moment he was back in Wutai, having nearly been flattened by one of their ogres. Angeal had saved his neck, and was standing over him. He'd used the Buster Sword, and... "You're a little more important than my sword. Just a little." It was like a physical ache to dismiss his sword in favor of hauling one of Cloud's arms over his shoulder to steady the trooper. "Fall back!" Zack roared. "You lot form up and cover our retreat with gunfire. I want you rookie soldiers up front to cut us a safe passage. Move it!" More quietly, he angled his head down to speak to Cloud. "Just hang on. We'll get you out of those clothes as soon as we're somewhere safe." He hoped if they retreated, they'd find some defensible place. Around him, the scramble and scuffle of personnel following the orders filled the air. They were probably just glad that someone was in control of the situation, or even the illusion of it. Zack just concentrated on directing Cloud to walk northeast along the cliff. In Zack's mind, all he could think was that they needed to make their way back towards the rendezvous point and get out a mayday call. The racket of rifle fire exploded into a thunderous roar behind them, and Zack looked over his shoulder in time to see the infantrymen shuffling back. A few of the hippogriffs made an enraged dive for them, but they were forced to back off as another hail of bullets tore through their feathers. All of them had the mad glow of Mako in their eyes. Zack could see numerous glowing eyes in the shadowy trees, and even peering down the cliffs. This place, he guessed, had been home to their eyrie, and unfortunately they'd gotten into the mako. "Sir," a gasping voice called. He recognized it as the gregarious sparrow. "Sir," he panted out again. "When we were checking the area, we found a small canyon in the cliff face, just over there in the woods." Zack followed the trooper's gesture, and sure enough he could see the dark scar of an opening in the rock face. "If we—" Zack nodded sharply. He could already see where this was heading. "Contact the rest of your team and tell them to guide the troops there. The rest will just have to hide where they can." "Come on, Cloud, let's get over there," he muttered. All he got was a faint groan in response. He tightened his grip on Cloud's arm and waist as he hurried them forward. The trees pressed in close, and the underbrush dragged at his clothes and Cloud's as if trying to pull him out of Zack's grip. Every now and then he could see the flash of materia or rifle fire through the close-growing trees. It was darker here among them than it had been in the clearing, though it proved nothing for a soldier's enhanced senses. And even less so, since the gathering gloom of oncoming night had given Zack's eyes plenty of time to adjust. Zack kept half-turning to catch glimpses of Cloud's lolling head. The trooper's breaths were coming shorter and faster, and he couldn't help but worry. Cloud seemed to gather himself when Zack paused to reorientate. The tangle of trees had blotted out their destination. Though he still seemed weak, he managed to lift his head, and Zack was caught by surprise as Cloud stared at him. He still looked lost and confused, and Zack's worry for his condition only doubled when Cloud's eyes trailed off to the side to stare over Zack's shoulder, before his head tipped forward again. Zack winced in sympathy as Cloud's chin bounced off his chest, and watched helplessly as Cloud lifted his hand. It only made it to chest height before falling limply again. Zack thought he heard him make a disgruntled little sound. "It's okay," Zack murmured, readjusting his grip around Cloud's waist. "It's just the mako making you weak. You're still doing better than a lot of people, though. Hopefully it won't take too long and we can get you some treatment." When Zack started them moving again, Cloud seemed to wrestle his body under his control, and managed a few steps on his own through what Zack guessed was sheer, stubborn determination. Cloud's side bumped against Zack's as he staggered over the rock-strewn, uneven ground. The only thing Zack could do was keep up a litany of murmured encouragements as he tried to keep them going in the right direction. Zack stumbled as a hippogriff flew low over their heads, rustling branches and sending leaves falling around them. He watched it warily and held them both still in the hopes that it hadn't seen them. For a moment he thought it had passed out of range. Then it was back, clearly having circled around. A second later it dropped heavily to the ground, a few feet ahead of them, beak parted on a raspy hiss, and mad eyes staring straight through them. Zack pressed his lips into a thin line and stared at the bird. He didn't dare try to make a run for it with Cloud weighing him down. The best solution was to take the hippogriff out. He could deal with this. Just because he didn't have a sword on him didn't leave him helpless. Angeal had made sure of that. Zack backed them up enough that he could guide Cloud to use a tree for support, then slid out from under his arm. "Wait here," Zack murmured as he helped Cloud slide to the ground, never taking his attention off the monster. The hippogriff was ripping at the ground with its talons. It seemed almost confused by his behavior. Cloud's head lolled to the side, and he groaned again. Zack chanced to glance towards him to see Cloud's hand lifting, reaching, before it dropped futilely back to the ground. In an attempt to reassure him, Zack added, "I'll take care of this." Zack edged slowly away from Cloud, eyes locked on the hippogriff. The sound of his boots as they ground against the rough soil loud in his ears. The beast watched him, its brightly coloured feathers trembling. These monsters were known for being able to entrap and bewitch their prey. Something about their feathers, maybe. Zack hadn't really paid the imparted information much mind beyond understanding the effect. So long as he could avoid that, then he'd be fine. He couldn't help but worry for the other men, though. If they'd been cut off similarly. Well, no time to worry about that. Zack brought his hands up, shook them out, and clenched them into fists so tight the leather of his gloves creaked. "That's right," Zack said. "Just keep your eyes on me." It bristled further, as if the sound of his voice was an irritant, and the next thing Zack knew, the beast was leaping at him. Its front talons slashed through the air, reaching and clawing for him. He swayed back as the hippogriff's claws whistled through the air inches in front of his nose. Zack's wide eyes met the gaze of the monster for a second, before he lashed out. His boot slammed into the hippogriff's keelbone and sent it skidding backwards with a startled squawk. He snorted out a pent-up breath. Too close. Way too close. There was no Angeal or Sephiroth here to save him if he lost focus this time. His traitorous heart, the part that still hurt, now nearly a year after Angeal's death, whispered that his mentor would never be there to help him again. Zack shoved the ache down and swung his arm up, materia glowing, and unleashed a torrent of electricity just as the hippogriff shook off the pain of his kick. The bird screamed as the thick bolts flowed over and around it, cracking and scoring across the ground and nearby trees. Zack jerked his hand back, closed his fist, and ended the spell. It left him tingling with the residue of both magic used, and the electric charge in the air that was accompanied by the stink of singed feathers. From where it had collapsed into a twitching heap, the hippogriff released a shrill little keening sound. Zack grimaced and walked cautiously towards the downed beast. He leaned over it, face twisting faintly with distaste. He hated not having Buster Sword with him on principle, but this was just adding another layer to it. If he'd had the sword, he would have been able to put the beast out of its misery easily. Just as he started to back away, the hippogriff he'd thought too far gone to pose a threat gathered itself and snapped at his shin. By the time Zack had halted his quick backward stumble, it had staggered to its feet. The hippogriff screamed a shrill, cracked sound that was nothing but rage, pain, and madness, then lunged at him furiously. He was knocked off balance as its claws scraped noisily over the curve of one shoulder guard. It had just missed slicing into the side of his neck. Even now he could feel the warm sensation of a bead of blood sliding down his throat. He was too busy to worry about it as the hippogriff's neck snapped out in an attempt to gouge his eyes with its beak. Zack jerked his head back, just a fraction too slow, and felt the tip of the hippogriff's beak clip his hairline. Quickly, before the blood could have a chance to obscure his vision, or the bird manage a more lethal attack, Zack brought his arm up and socked it in the side of the head hard enough for his knuckles to ache. He heard something crack, but couldn't be sure what it was as the force had spun the bird to the side. Zack didn't give himself a chance to think, or the hippogriff a chance to retaliate. He charged forward and unleashed a fury of blows on the monster, then finished it off with an abrupt kick to its neck. He heard, felt, the bones crunch under the force of the blow, which sent the hippogriff into the dirt again. This time it twitched spasmodically for a few seconds, its neck bent at an obviously broken angle. Then it lay still. Zack backed away, then turned his back on the cooling corpse and strode back to Cloud's side. He knelt down beside Cloud and reached out to grip his shoulder. The trooper's head lolled back until Cloud could look at him dazedly. Zack watched him blink for a moment and thought he saw some focus, some recognition come back into Cloud's glazed expression. He grinned. "See, what did I tell you?" Zack said as he dashed the back of his forearm across his forehead to keep a dribble of blood from getting into his eye. All he really seemed to accomplish was smear it across his forehead. In the next second, Zack paid for his moment of inattention when he found himself tackled by another of the beasts. Zack hit the ground on his shoulder, his breath rushing out of him. His ears buzzed, and silence filled his head. He could see Cloud lurch forward, eyes wide, could see him lift his hand and reach out, heard the slurred, rough, "Zah," in what seemed like endless hours as he struggled to catch his breath. It all rushed back as Cloud's supporting arm went out from under him, pitching him forward, and the hippogriff's talons flashed down, obscuring Zack's line of sight. Zack twisted onto his back and brought his hands up just in time to grab the hippogriff's throat with one hand and its beak with the other. His glove slid over the monster's sleek feathers as it strained against his hold. Zack's face twisted with concentration, muscles bunching and tensing against its power and against the pain of its beak clamping down on his thumb. It almost felt as if it was grinding against the very bone. He decided he was probably just lucky it hadn't taken his thumb clean off. His breath was stolen from him in a gasp of pain as the monster yanked its head to the side, jerking on his arm. In retaliation, Zack dug his fingers into the feathers more firmly and brought his knees up to slam into the hippogriff's tender belly. The monster grunted and gave him another wrenching shake. Zack drove his knee up again, and this time the hippogriff released his thumb with an enraged shriek and reared back as far as it could. He could feel the clump of feathers in his fist beginning to tear. With his now free hand, Zack reached up to grab the other side of the beast's neck and haul himself up. He freed up one hand to reach further around the monster's neck for a better hold, even as he dug one boot heel into the ground for leverage and kicked one of the monster's hind legs. The hippogriff staggered, screeching, and tossed its head in confusion before Zack kicked its leg again. This time the bones in the beast's hind leg snapped with an audible crack, and the hippogriff screamed in pain as it toppled. Zack released his hold to scramble out of the way and came quickly to his knees. Already the hippogriff had managed to get back up, though the broken leg dangled uselessly, where it was held a few inches off the ground. The hippogriff had compensated easily enough with its wings spread for balance. It hissed at him, eyes rolling madly, then shoved off the ground in a flurry of powerful wing beats. It drove its wings down again to propel itself higher, and Zack brought himself to his feet, every muscle tense for the next attack. Before either Zack or the hippogriff could make a move, a sharp whirring filled the air, and a second later a flash of red and silver arced out of the shadows to score a deep wound across the hippogriff's exposed underbelly. The monster screamed and fell heavily to the ground while the weapon arced back into the shadows. Zack lifted his hand as the sharp sound of quick footfalls fast approached, and grimly called up the power of his materia to unleash another torrent of lightning. The hippogriff squealed, body twisting and arcing, before it slumped into the blood-soaked ground. Zack just stood there, staring at the corpse for several seconds, until the sound of footsteps stopped close by. When he lifted his head, it was to nod in acknowledgement to Cisne, though he didn't know whether to be shocked or relieved that she was there. "Hey, Cisne," he greeted with a wry grin. "Thanks for having my back." "No problem, Zack," the Turk said softly. She flashed him a fleeting smile, then sent a troubled look off to Zack's left. "Is your friend okay?" Zack turned and made his way back to Cloud's side, where the fallen trooper had managed to brace himself up on his forearms again. The hazy expression on his face looked an odd mixture of disgruntled and determined to Zack. Zack glanced over his shoulder at Cisne as he crouched down beside Cloud. "He will be," he said easily. As he turned his attention back to Cloud, Zack decided that he would make sure of it. "What are you still doing here, Cisne?" "I had an assignment in the area and heard all the ruckus." Cisne's response was just as quiet as her previous words, but somehow they unsettled Zack. It just made Zack's paranoid thoughts about the Turks swim back up. Determinedly, he pushed the matter of the Turks to the back of his mind. Right now, he needed to focus on Cloud, the rest of his troops, and how to get them out of the situation mostly intact. Reaching down, he gripped Cloud's shoulder, pulling him up enough to slide his arm under him, and hauled the trooper into a sitting position. Cloud gave a startled cry and looked up at him dazedly. "Whoa, hey, take it easy, Cloud. It's just me," Zack soothed. "You okay?" Cloud's face relaxed and, after what looked like a momentary struggle with himself, managed a semblance of a nod. Zack's own expression relaxed into a relieved grin. He'd take that as a good sign, if there ever was one. The fact that Cloud seemed to understand him and even respond properly meant the Mako poisoning he was suffering wasn't too bad. Zack looked up from his silent, internal celebration at the faint scuff of a shoe just behind him. Cisne leaned forward, coppery hair tumbling over her shoulder, and asked, "What about you?" When her eyes flicked up to his hairline, Zack automatically reached up and rubbed his forearm over the still bleeding cut on his forehead. He doubted it'd be bleeding much longer, but head wounds always did bleed more persistently than most other varieties. He shrugged, readjusted his grip on Cloud, then got them both to their feet with minimal staggering. "I'm fine. That was nothing," he assured her breezily. He didn't want to mention that he was feeling a bit nauseous himself. "So, Cloud, you think you can make it a little further?" He didn't really wait for an answer, nor did he really expect one. Zack just tightened his grip and began walking with the hope that Cloud could hang on just a little longer. Cissnei followed near soundlessly after them. Their progress was accompanied only by the rustle of trees and the sudden, shocking silence that had fallen. It was into this silence that Cissnei's next words fell. I already put a call in to Tseng, so there should be backup on the way as soon as possible. Relief, the likes of which Zack hadn't felt since Angeal had seemed to be coming around, swept through him. It felt like a great deal of weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Thanks, Cissnei, Zack said softly. He took a moment to check their course and realized he couldn't see the opening of the cliff face they'd been heading for anymore. The woods all looked the same, with it being well and truly night. The cliff face looked like it was made of shallow niches and openings even to his soldier eyes. In the end, he decided it didn't matter, so long as they put some distance between themselves and the hippogriffs. Do you know how my men are doing? Most of them seem to have gone to ground, Cissnei replied immediately. I saw a few on my way and advised them to take cover. Good. That was good. As long as they stayed hidden until dawn, they could regroup. Before he knew it, the forest opened up and spilled them back out into the open dirt and rock. He recognized the slope ahead of them as the one he'd come down to reach the little wooded area earlier in the day. There was no way he could get Cloud to climb that in his condition. A rustle to their left alerted him to movement, even as Cissnei brought Rekka up. Sir, is that you? The voice was familiar again. Hurriedly, Zack asked, Jack? Yes, sir, the trooper murmured as he emerged from the bush. I thought I saw someone, so... me and a few others found a thicket that we're using for cover. So, if you want to come with me, sir? By all means, lead the way. It only took a minute or two before they joined a small, ruffled-looking group of troopers and a couple rookie soldiers. As Zack eased Cloud to sit down against the thick base of a tree, he glanced around at them. Do any of you have supplies with you? A spare uniform or spare clothes? He couldn't imagine those Mako-soaked clothes were doing anything for the poor guy. I do, sir, one of the troopers muttered. You can use them for Cloud. I was with his team, so... Which meant that he'd arrived late, and still had all his equipment on him, unlike most of the others who had left theirs in the clearing with the Mako pool, and hadn't been able to retrieve them in the mad scramble to retreat. Zack accepted the pack from the man, then crouched down beside Cloud. Hey, Cloud, you still with me, buddy? He reached out and tilted Cloud's head back. He looked feverish. Zack's smile took on a worried edge, while Cloud's eyes roamed restlessly. He seemed to be tracking movement over Zack's shoulder, and Zack could only wonder if it were the other men in the area, or Mako dreams. Then Cloud seemed to pull himself together again, and focused on Zack. For a second he merely blinked at Zack with his brows furrowed, and a faint frown pulling at his lips. A moment later, Zack felt the weight of a hand gripping his arm. It was a surprisingly strong grip. Zack... Cloud slurred, still apparently unable to form the sharper k sound. Zack forced his smile to be more genuine, more reassuring, and rested his hand on Cloud's head. Hey, he greeted quietly. Then to lighten the mood added, At least you remember me. Or am I just getting that famous already? That got no further response. Zack wasn't really surprised. He reached up to swipe a hand over his hair, only to stop as he caught sight of a green film of Mako on his gloves. Zack grimaced, pulled them off, and tossed them carelessly aside. When he turned back to Cloud, he could see the stuff gleaming faintly on him as well. It was no question what needed to be done. I'm going to get those clothes off you, and see if we can get as much of the Mako off as possible. He was no medic, but he knew a bit about Mako poisoning and Mako addiction. As far as he could tell, Cloud didn't seem too badly off. Weak and a bit unresponsive, yes, but he was responsive. Maybe he'd gotten lucky and the Mako really had been nicely diluted in the water. It was easy enough to get Cloud's harness and shoulder armor off. The general infantryman's variety wasn't that different from a soldier's, decoration aside. All of the clasps were in the same place at least. It was after he'd pulled off Cloud's gloves and was starting to help him get his shirt off that Cloud gave a hiss, his muscles convulsing and his back arching. Zack winced as well. Sorry, he muttered under his breath, even as he waited the fit out. When he continued, he did so even more carefully. It didn't take much work, and Zack tossed that aside as well, pulled off Cloud's boots, then leaned over the dazed trooper to start working off his belt. The others hiding with them were quiet, probably listening for the sounds of an attack, or maybe just trying to give the poor guy as much privacy as could be afforded. It was hard to say. Zack, for his part, didn't really care what they did, and decided to see if he could get more responses out of Cloud, who seemed to be moving better. At least he was able to move his arms and legs enough to facilitate Zack's removal of his clothes. We didn't get a chance to talk after Mariaheim. How's Midgar been treating you? I don't think you were stationed there before, because I'm sure I'd have noticed someone like you wandering around the Shinra building. Not that he'd really notice Cloud now, either, Zack thought ruefully as he tossed Cloud's pants aside. He spent all of his time these days loitering around the soldier floor, out on missions, or down in the slums with Aerith. Here, sir, a soft voice muttered. A canteen was thrust over his shoulder, and Zack gladly accepted it, to help get the Mako off. Zack offered the trooper a brief smile of gratitude before turning back to Cloud. You're lucky your underwear don't seem to have gotten it too bad, so you won't have to worry about chafing. Reaching up, he pulled Cloud forward so that he could pour the lukewarm water over his head, and briefly whisked a hand through Cloud's blonde hair to work out as much of the clinging Mako as possible. He shifted a little more, then let Cloud's head rest against his shoulder so he could see his back and get the Mako from there with the aid of more water. From there he moved on to Cloud's arms, chest, and finally his legs. That ought to do it. You're drying fine in this weather, so I'll go ahead and get you dressed, he mused, rinsing off his own hands, then reached for the spare uniform the trooper had given him. It took a bit more work to get Cloud back into the clothes, but was doable. They were a bit big on him, but at least they were clothes, and they weren't saturated in Mako. When he was done, Zack shifted around to collapse by Cloud's side and lean up against the tree too. Well, I guess all that's left is to wait for dawn. He could see Cissnei lurking silently in the shadows, watching them, and he flashed her a brief grin. Her only response was, You should make sure you get it off you as well, Zack. Zack shrugged negligently. He'd worry about it in a bit. For now he was more interested in keeping an eye on Cloud. Zack felt Cloud shift until he was slumped a little more against his side, followed by the feel of Cloud's hand fumbling along his leg and arm. Cloud's fingers wrapped around his wrist, surprisingly firm for his apparently disorientated state. Worried that Cloud was trying to get his attention for some reason, Zack leaned in close as Cloud's grip shifted to his hand. You okay? The words had barely left him when Cloud's grip tightened, and he made a strange little sound. Zack? To Zack it sounded wondering and painful, though he couldn't fathom what would make Cloud say his name like that. Before he could even think on it, Cloud stumbled haltingly through more words. Are you real? Zack's heart went out to him, even as his skin prickled with unease. It was worrying. Zack couldn't help but think, if Cloud was having trouble telling reality from Mako-induced hallucinations. Cloud was obviously seeking some sort of anchor in reality, and Zack would provide him that. They didn't really know each other, but Zack still considered him a friend. Some people told him he made friends too easily. Cloud was his fellow country boy, and they had to stick together, friends or not. He carefully squeezed Cloud's hand in response to his clutching, and, voice low, replied, Yeah, I'm real. Just as real as you are. He glanced down towards Cloud's blonde head, then scooted closer to him. Zack had no idea if he was cold, or if he had a fever, or even how to really deal with him in this condition. He kind of wished he'd wound up somewhere with one of the medically trained personnel, but he could manage. He had enough know-how to do it. He had to. Say, Cloud, Zack mumbled. Try to stay awake as long as possible, okay? He was half afraid that if Cloud fell asleep, they'd lose him into a coma that he might not wake up from. He was getting all too used to the biting tang of failing to save someone, and he wasn't going to let another friend fall to his track record. He tossed around for something to talk about, something to keep Cloud's attention focused on, and let the weak blonde grasp his hand. If that helped keep Cloud grounded, then Zack was all for it. The weather's pretty nice here for this time of year, isn't it? It was a terrible attempt at conversation, but it wasn't the topic that mattered, not really. It was eerily quiet, just as it had been all day. There were no night predators creeping about. Zack suspected that the hippogriffs had run everything and anything off. There was barely any light at all, though that hardly affected him. He supposed he'd grown used to the constant glow of Midgar and Shinra's other cities. It reminded him a bit of Gongaga when he was younger, when night meant a world of pitch-black mystery and thrill, where the sky was full of stars and not blocked out by the ambient electric lighting so much. You said you were from Nibelheim, right? I bet it's really cold up there this time of year. Or any time of year for that matter. But I bet the stars are really nice. They were always blocked out in Gongaga, unless you knew where to look. Because of the dense forest, unlike Midgar. Zack had known this one little cliff, though. Zack could almost feel that he was being listened to, and not just by Cloud, but by the bedraggled group in the shadows around him. Occasionally he could hear someone shift, noted their position from the rustle of fabric and the jangle of metal. But mostly he kept his head tilted back against the tree behind him and watched the breeze rustle the leaves. Sometimes he even caught a glimpse of a star-filled sky. From the corner of his eyes he watched Cloud, and across from him he could see Cisne leaning against another tree. She glanced his way and nodded slightly. He didn't know if she could see him as well as he could see her, but he took the motion for what it was. All was well on her end. Zack lifted his hand in a return gesture. So far, so good, but the pale light of dawn never felt so far away. Nibelheim. It's kinda nice, Cloud said at last, as though he had to gather his scattered thoughts. He sounded hoarse. The monsters went mad because of the reactor. Too much, Mako. One of the dragons nearly ate me, though. You would have laughed. Cloud's voice dropped off in a hiss of pain, and Zack mulled what he said over. Dragons, huh? He'd heard about nibble dragons, and he couldn't help but give Cloud's blonde head a slightly incredulous look. He'd nearly been eaten by dragons. How, Zack couldn't help but wonder, did he manage to get out of that one? Then and there, Zack decided that if he was ever forced to go to Nibelheim, he'd take Cloud with him. That way the dragon issue would be less of an issue. Maybe. He had no idea how fearsome the beasts really were, but he'd heard stories. There were a lot of scary stories floating around Midgar. Why, he heard a funny one involving Gongaga once that had him laughing for weeks. He wanted to say he wasn't sure dragons were a funny issue, but on the other hand, the mental image of a tiny Cloud managing to best one of the beasts was rather hilarious, which, for whatever reason, just led him to wondering what Cloud had looked like as a kid. Cloud, who already stuck out like a sore thumb among the rank and file. He thought about offering Cloud a cure, or something. Zack always made sure that he had a mastered cure material on him. He was a bit put off that he hadn't yet managed to find a curer, but he was unsure how it would react to Cloud's recent dip in the Mako. It would probably be best to wait. Cloud seemed to be pretty lucid for his recent brush with the Mako. He seemed to be getting better by the moment. If he was still in pain come morning, then Zack would worry about it then. Hopefully that would be enough time for the Mako exposure to blow over as well. The last thing he wanted to... It took Zack a moment to realize Cloud was talking again. Angel always had scolded him for his lack of focus. The experiments got loose too. I hope one of the others goes up there first. They're completely gone now. Whoa, wait, back up. Experiments? What in the world was Cloud on about now? Across from him, Zack could see Cisne look up sharply. He was abruptly worried that Cloud had gotten into something deep that would attract the wrong kind of Turk attention. If any Turk attention could be considered good, anyway. Were there experiments up in Nibelheim? And if so, why were they there? And why were they somewhere a civilian kid could find them? Or was he... Zack gave his head a slight shake. What was he thinking? Cloud's mutterings were broken and disjointed. It was more probable that he'd just skipped from the topic of monsters gone mad in Nibelheim, from the reactor, straight into a memory of one of the breakouts from Hojo's labs that seemed to happen a little too often and conveniently. It was obvious that he and his squad had been dispatched during one breakout, and had to deal with some of the nasty beasts, right? Right. It was the only logical conclusion, and the only one that didn't send Zack into a fit of worry. Aerith, you're happy with her, right? I couldn't save. But I watch her flowers. The kids like the church too. Zach's mind scrambled to make sense of Cloud's confusing words, even as Cloud fell silent with a faint cough, and his head lolled to rest against Zach's shoulder. Aerith? How could Cloud know Aerith? More than that, how did he know about Zach and Aerith? It wasn't exactly like Zach didn't talk about her, but no one really knew who she was. Cloud had mentioned specifics that were more than a little baffling. Zach could almost feel the tension coming off Cisne, which, he guessed, meant they hadn't known Cloud knew Aerith either. Turks didn't like not knowing. Aerith had never mentioned knowing anyone else from Shinra to Zach either. He wanted badly to ask Cloud how he knew Aerith, but Zach decided to err on the side of caution. The last thing Cloud needed was the Turks poking around his business, or worse, deeming him a threat that needed to be terminated. Best case, he wound up dead and no one ever saw him again. Worst case, Zach wasn't even sure what the worst case was anymore after Angeal and Genesis.
You know Aerith too, huh? She's great, isn't she? Real nice,
Zach said breezily, as if this wasn't something unusual.
You into gardening too? Does she actually let you help with the flowers because she won't let me help? She says that they only want to be tended by her, but I guess she'd know best. I saw some pretty little wildflowers on the way here, and I was thinking of taking some back to her. You think she'd like that? Or would I just get a lecture about leaving them alone?
I'm sure anything you give her, she'll love, Cloud offered tentatively. Zach didn't say anything as Cloud slumped further, his eyes drooping closed as he drifted off into an obviously exhausted sleep. He didn't let it show, but Zach could swear his heart rate had tripled. He was scared that, come morning, Cloud wouldn't wake up. December 11th. Zach hadn't slept the entire night, too hyped up to bother, and it didn't really matter anyway. He wasn't feeling it, yet. But he probably would be if he didn't get something to eat before too long. Zach knew his limits well enough, knew how far he could push, and he was no risk of crashing just yet. The night had been spent in a vigilant haze, his attention torn between keeping an eye on Cloud and watching for threats. Both external and internal. He didn't want to think about Cisne like that, but he had been having creeping doubts ever since Angeal. Something he didn't want to think about right now. He had to focus on Cloud, and getting as many people out of this mission in one piece as possible. Zach was honestly surprised to see how strong a grip Cloud had. It had been both relieving and baffling the way Cloud continued to cling to him, even in his sleep. Relieving because it probably meant Cloud wasn't lost in his own head, and baffling because, really, they barely knew each other. Zach suspected it was the anchor thing that he'd been thinking about earlier, something to hang on to metaphorically instead of physically clutching. It all kind of made his head hurt. He usually let Kunzel do the deep thinking. Zach was more reactionary. Zach's mind seemed content to skip from one subject to another in his inaction, so he let it. He was sitting with one arm pinned by Cloud, the other draped over his upraised knee, and listening to the quiet rise in activity as the others woke up. There was still no bird song, and Cisne was the only one still really awake. Zach figured he should have scolded some of the troopers and rookies for dozing off, but he couldn't blame them. The entire mission had gone way, way out of control. Cisne met his gaze, then looked away again. They had barely said 3 words to each other all night. Some would say that was a record for Zach, but Zach knew he'd just been too busy tying himself up in knots. Could he trust her? Could he not? Could he trust anyone anymore? It was times like this that he really, really wished Angeal was still around. What should I do, Angeal? Then Cloud stirred beside him, and Zach straightened his spine from his slouch. A heartbeat later, his phone trilled in his pocket. Zach blinked, momentarily baffled, before trying to tug his hand free to search for the device. Cloud, however, didn't seem to want to let go, and had actually lifted both his free hand and the one clutching Zach's up. He appeared to be giving Zach's hand a rather bewildered look. In the end, Zach let him keep the hand for the moment. After all, he had another in perfectly working order, which he used to dig his phone from his pocket. As Zach pulled his phone out at last, Cloud's tentative voice reached him. Good morning? Zack thought he sounded more than a little lost.
Good morning yourself, sunshine. Feeling any better?
Even as the words left him, Zack flipped his phone open and answered.
What can I do for you?
His answer was a soft, curious, "Hello?" That made the grin on Zack's face go from distracted to genuine. "Aerith!" A quiet laugh answered him, before she asked, "Is now a bad time? You sound distracted."
No, now isn't a bad time, not really, he said, then paused as an idea occurred to him. But hold on. Do me a favor and talk to my friend while I make sure he's doing all right, okay?
Your friend? Is he hurt?
Zack blinked. What? No, he's just a little ill right now.
Okay. He could imagine her nodding in firm agreement with her decision. I'll talk to him. You just make sure he's all right.
Thanks, Zack chirped. Then he shoved the phone into Cloud's hand and freed the one Cloud was still gripping. I'll need my hand, if you don't mind, he added, scratching at the dried blood on his temple. Do me a favor and talk to Aerith while I make sure everything is okay this morning, would you? Cloud was staring at the phone in his hand as if he'd never seen it before, and even as Zack watched, he gave a sudden twitch. Zack reached out for his bowed head, slightly worried that Cloud's seemingly improved condition had taken a rapid fall, only to have his hand batted away. He let himself smile and listened to Aerith's curious voice as it emerged, tiny and small, from the phone. When Aerith gave a particularly pointed, "Hello!" Zack had to stifle a laugh. Cloud hastily brought the phone to his ear. "Hello?" Cloud asked softly. Careful not to draw too much attention to himself, Zack leaned forward and captured Cloud's other wrist to check his pulse. It didn't feel thready, nor too slow or too fast. He guessed that was a good thing. "I know," he heard Cloud mumble. Zack glanced up to see his head was still bowed, his attention seemingly focused on the ground between his boots. "It's Cloud." It was hard not to act like he was actively eavesdropping, but he was undeniably curious. Zack only wished he could hear what Aerith was saying as Cloud nodded in response to whatever she'd said. Suspicions aside, Zack couldn't help but grin like an idiot. He could only take all of this as a good sign. Cloud certainly seemed more animated than he'd been last night. He was still a bit on the quiet side, but he hadn't been all that talkative during Modiaheim mission either. Maybe he was just naturally quiet, though he hadn't seemed quite this downtrodden when Zack had met him. But then Zack didn't blame him for feeling like crap. He reached out again once he was sure Cloud was momentarily distracted, gripping Cloud's chin and pulling his face up so that he could peer into his eyes. Cloud's pupils were still dilated, and his eyes, they had that obvious glow, and, if Zack wasn't mistaken, even might be a little brighter than the average soldier. That probably wasn't a good sign. "Hey, Cloud," he said to draw attention to himself. He lifted his other hand and waved 3 fingers in front of the blonde's nose. "How many fingers am I holding up?" He'd always kind of wanted to do that. Behind him, he heard Cisne murmur, "You make quite the nursemaid, Zack." Grinning, eyes never leaving Cloud, Zack blithely said, "Maybe once we get back to Midgar, I'll give up my soldier ways and apply to the medical staff." Cloud's eyes nearly crossed as he attempted to focus on Zack's fingers. It took everything Zack had to keep from bursting out laughing then and there. It was just too silly an image after the stress of the night before. "Aerith?" Cloud said at last, clearly having given up on Zack. He paused oddly, which caught Zack's attention. His next words nearly shattered Zack's resolve to keep from laughing. "Zack is touching me." It was all in the way he said it. A sort of dumbstruck confusion. A few guffaws broke out behind him, and Zack forcibly swallowed his own laughs. He allowed his friendly grin to slide into something like a playful leer and scolded, "Aw, Cloud, you're not supposed to go snitching to my girlfriend." Overall, Cloud seemed to be all right. His eyes were still unfocused, and he still seemed to be a lot lost and confused. But Zack was pleased with his prognosis, and that was just fine. Reaching out, he ruffled Cloud's hair again, before snatching the phone from him. "I'm going to step over here and patch things up. You lot hang on to your bootstraps." With a gregarious wink, Zack sidled off far enough that he wouldn't be heard if he kept his voice low. The playful grin slid off his face like water running off rock, and by the time he came to a stop, he once more wore a serious expression. "Hey, Aerith?" Her curious prompted him to continue. He felt a bit silly for asking, but... "Before today, have you ever talked to Cloud?" Aerith went quiet, and Zack waited. 1 heartbeat, 2. "No, I don't think so. Should I know him?" That's what he thought. Something fishy was going on around here. "Oh no, I was just curious. I must have mentioned you when I met him and forgot about it. Don't worry. He seems interested in flowers, so I promise I'll introduce you once we're back in Midgar, okay?" "I'll look forward to it," she said. There was an underlying, deeper happiness in her voice that Zack couldn't really find a meaning for. After another pause, she added, "You look after him, okay?" She always sounded like she knew more, sounded so wise. It was definitely one of her charms. "Sure," he said pleasantly. "So, how's everything in Midgar?" With that, Aerith was telling him about her flowers and the people of the slums, and Zack let it wash over him and ease away more of the remaining tension that had been eating away at him. He should be getting back soon. He had troops to round up and a retreat to organize. So once a lull in the conversation opened up, he said, "I need to go, Aerith. Get the troops up and all, but hey, I'll be visiting again sooner than I thought. We ought to be back in Midgar early." "That's good. Maybe you can finally get started on that flower wagon you promised me." She was teasing. He knew it, and it made him grin. "Is that all I'm good for? Free labor?" "Why else would I keep you around?" Zack could easily imagine the slightly shy, but still present, impish smile on her face. Could see the light that seeped under the plate make her seem to glow in her favorite white sundress. "Oh, I don't know. Kinda hoped you enjoyed my company," he teased. "You're sweet," she replied without missing a beat. "But we both know my flowers are the important thing here." "Absolutely," he said cheerfully. "So you go look after them, and I'll talk to you later." "Bye," she sang. Zack waited for the line to go dead before he pulled his phone from his ear and snapped it closed. It wasn't far to get back to Cloud and the troops, and then... time to get them all home. He'd worry about mysteries after that. Cloud could only watch helplessly as Zack disappeared into the vegetation around them, unable to muster his lethargic and aching body to even call out to him. He hadn't had enough time to comprehend all that was happening, and Zack was barreling around him like a hyperactive dog, unable to sit still and stop making him dizzy. When Zack was out of sight, Cloud fought down his unease, determined to take a moment to observe his surroundings and get his bearings. In the warm light of dawn, everything looked real, normal. It was nothing but a forest with leafy trees above him, thick growth between the trunks, and a dirt and debris-strewn ground. While this should have been comforting and reassuring, it only further served to drive the disquieting feeling in his stomach deeper. Only made him question what was real and what wasn't even more. It felt all too surreal to Cloud. His body ached fiercely, and he still felt like his head was only attached marginally to his shoulders, like any move would either make it float away or implode from pain. Yet the memory of the warm, living body of his friend sitting next to him, not lying dying and broken in the rain, not a mirage from the live stream, remained with him. Or was it? Perhaps all this was just the last few seconds of his life stretching into an eternity of regrets, and his body was still dissolving in the green of the live stream. And talking to Aerith on a phone? Zack. Was it even really Zack? Or was it just some amalgamation his spotty memories had conjured? Had to be insane. Maybe the afterlife had good service? The thought, this entire train of thought, was ridiculous. If he needed any further proof of his own madness, Cloud figured that had to be it. Cloud looked up as he was driven roughly from his muddled thoughts by the sound of people pressing in. Shinra grunts, he noted from their uniforms. Why were there people dressed in the old outfits that had been abandoned after the destruction of Midgar? Rufus had been too busy with the construction of Edge and the worry of Geostigma to bother with rebuilding the depleted army.
That knowledge didn't make seeing Shinra uniforms any easier, and Cloud shifted against the tree uncomfortably as he was surrounded. He really was in no condition to defend himself against them, if they decided to turn hostile in Zack's absence. Why did his mind refuse to let that go? It wasn't possible. Stop hoping, wishing. You're deluded.
"Hey, are you okay?" one of the troopers asked, squatting down in front of him. His helmet was off, though his mousy brown hair was still plastered to his skull, the way only prolonged usage of headgear would cause. "I mean, obviously you're not okay, but damn, man. You just took a headfirst dive into Mako. It's amazing you're even alive," he continued enthusiastically. "Soldier Fair was right behind you, too,"
another trooper said, tilting his own helmet back so his eyes could be seen.
"I thought he was going to dive right in. Soldiers are amazing. He covered 100 yards in just a second." "Is that what happened?"
a third trooper asked in astonishment. Cloud could barely keep up, head turning mechanically to each new speaker as they filled the air with a hushed, excited jabber, none of which was really making sense. It didn't help that his head was still pounding, and he could still sense a calculating stare burrowing into him. He focused on a figure still lounging against a tree nearby, meeting the intense gaze of a young woman. Where the Shinra uniforms had made Cloud uncomfortable, the woman's outfit made him downright paranoid. She was dressed like a Turk, but not one he'd seen before. The only Turks left should have been Reno, Rude, Elena, and Sang. Vincent too, if you wanted to get technical. If Rufus was recruiting, Cloud wanted to know why.
"You're from Nibelheim, then?"
she asked when their gazes met, voice soft but cutting through the troopers' babbling. They immediately hushed, like naughty schoolchildren realizing the teacher was standing behind them. Cloud tensed. He did not want to be in this vulnerable position at the mercy of a perceived Turk.
"Hey, miss, leave the guy alone. He's not really all there yet,"
the first trooper protested weakly. Cloud hated feeling grateful to anything associated with Shinra, but he appreciated the young man's efforts. He looked faint at his own daring, anyway. Cloud braced himself, feeling his muscles scream in pain at each movement as he used the tree to steady himself. He slowly slid up it until he regained his feet. It was hardly any better than sitting slumped against it, but at least he felt a little better at the minor play of defiance. The burning pain of Mako had all but vanished by now, though Cloud's body still ached. He was struck again by the abnormal symptom. Mako left you feeling dizzy and ill, restless and useless at the same time, all of which Cloud was indeed experiencing. But it was almost as if he'd overexerted himself as well, which was a rare occurrence thanks to his enhancements. He flinched when one of the troopers surrounding him tried to reach out a hand to steady him, and knocked it aside with a jerky movement of his arm. "Don't touch," he wheezed, a bit taken aback at the hurt expression on the trooper's face. Surely most people still associated with Shinra knew who he was, and to avoid contact with him if at all possible. Unless that life was the dream, and then they shouldn't care about his feelings and just be trying to kill him. Cloud was confusing himself again, and dismissed the thoughts to concentrate on the bigger threat. Where was Zack? Or whoever, or whatever it was that seemed to be wearing his face. It was then that Zack emerged from the vegetation, bare hands shoving against branches heavy with leaves. He moved seamlessly to stand between Cloud and the Shinra troopers. Cloud hadn't heard the man approach, another occurrence that hadn't happened to him in quite a while. The presence of his friend was reassuring since Cloud's knees were already weakening from the strain of keeping himself upright, even if it wasn't real.
"Jack's right, Cisne. Leave Cloud alone."
Although Cloud couldn't see his face, he doubted that Zack, couldn't be but was smiling. His stance was lazy and easygoing, but the meaning behind where he stood was obvious. It had been very deliberate, and Cloud could tell that the Turk knew it. Cloud didn't recognize her name. An imposter? For real? He didn't know anymore. Cloud was starting to wonder if he was trapped in his own head again, or maybe he'd never gotten out. Maybe nothing had been real. Cloud could just see the woman around Zack, could just see the searching look she gave his friend. Zack, who merely let her, as if awaiting judgment. Cloud could only feel bewildered as the two stared at each other, until after several seconds she looked away and inquired,
"He fell into some mako?" "It was heavily diluted by water, but yes, you saw the condition he was in last night."
The words drew Cloud's attention back to Zack. What was he talking about? He'd fallen into the heart of a reactor, or he was suffering from the effects of the experimentation Hojo had subjected him to.
"I did hear him talking a lot of nonsense last night," the Turk said. "I'll see if I can find some of the others while you take care of things here."
The bewilderment grew as the Turk turned away and disappeared into the underbrush. The words had been full of underlying meaning, and Cloud couldn't begin to understand. All he knew was that Zack had managed to get her to back off, so he allowed himself to relax slightly.
"Thanks, Cisne,"
Zack said softly, before turning back towards Cloud and the troopers and clapping his hands together. It seemed as though as soon as he set eyes on Cloud, his face fell. Cloud ducked his head, feeling unaccountably embarrassed. He didn't even realize Zack had moved towards him until he felt a hand on his shoulder, and Zack ducked down to get a look at his face. The smile he wore was sincere and apologetic.
"Oh man, I'm so sorry, Cloud. I completely forgot. Hold on, I'll see what I can do, all right?"
Cloud watched numbly as Zack patted down his pockets, unsure what to say. He was saved from having to come up with anything when Zack gave a triumphant "Aha!" and produced a gleaming green materia. A second later, the cool, tingling feel of a spell washed over him and made Cloud sag further in relief as some of the bone-deep ache vanished. The magic had an odd tang to it, more mechanical than he remembered the spell feeling before, but any relief from the constant pain he'd been in was welcomed. When he looked up, he found himself to be the center of surprisingly intense scrutiny from not only Zack, but the rest of the men in the area. Cloud shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond, or whether or not he should even try to say something. He was saved the effort when Zack said,
"What about the rest of you? Anyone else need a cure?" Not that I know of, sir,"
one trooper answered promptly. Cloud recognized him as the one who'd stood up to the Turk woman for him earlier. The trooper scratched at his hair for a second, then turned towards Zack himself.
"What about you, sir? I mean, you've got some—"
To make his point, the trooper gestured towards his forehead. Cloud followed the gesture in time to see Zack's bare hands scrub ruefully at the crust of dried blood decorating his hairline. When had he gotten that? A hazy memory drifted up, of Zack leaving him behind, being attacked. The terror of losing Zack all over again, and the overwhelming need to help him, to make sure nothing killed him again, and the uselessness of his mako-sick body that hadn't responded to his commands to save Zack. The thought, memory, dream, or whatever it was, made Cloud stare at Zack, mind spinning in confusion. Zack looked so much like Cloud remembered, with his wild black locks spilling down over his shoulders, the soldier's dark uniform, and the easy grin that was almost a constant ornament on his face. There was still something off, and it took him a moment to realize what it was. The Buster Sword was nowhere to be seen, not on Zack's back, and Cloud couldn't see it anywhere in the small area they were situated in. Zack had treasured that sword. Cloud tried not to forget the hazy memory of his own acquisition of the blade, and he couldn't remember the other man ever being without it. He was distracted from that when he noticed his own clothes. The Shinra trooper outfit was too big on him, and he recalled being changed into it sometime last night. The last time he'd worn the blue uniform had been during the undercover mission in Junon, when even Nanaki had masqueraded as one of Shinra's soldiers. That probably said a lot for Shinra's efficiency.
"Nah, it's already healed. I'm fine. Soldiers heal fast."
Zack's loud boast brought his wandering attention back to the present, and Cloud gave a soft snort of agreement. Hopefully Cloud's own pseudo-soldier body would finally kick in and get rid of the last of the aching in his body. He still felt unsteady, despite the cure spell Zack had cast. A sudden, sharp scream cut through the eerie, silent forest. followed by a sharp staccato of gunfire and monster shrieks. Cloud immediately tensed, suddenly aware that he was essentially in enemy territory. Zack's presence and the fact that he didn't seem worried about the Shinra goons had lulled him into a sense of security. Before Cloud could react further, Zack was already leaping into motion while barking orders.
Jack, Sparrow, you said you found a defensible little niche in the cliff wall last night. See if you can rendezvous with anyone who made it there, then get out of the woods. Take Cloud with you, would you?
The two troopers Zack had addressed straightened up and gave a sharp salute, and one said,
"Sir, I'll do my best."
Zack flashed him a distracted grin and nodded towards the wary-looking rookie thirds who had, until now, mostly been quiet.
You lot go with them and provide cover for the regular soldiers.
There was a chorus of,
"Yes, sir!"
and then Zack was gone. It had all happened too quickly for Cloud's sluggish mind to really process. It had seemed like between one blink and the next, Zack was there. Then the world exploded into hostile sounds of gunfire and shrieks, and his dark hair was vanishing into the undergrowth. Cloud tried not to panic, but it was hard when all his senses were telling him that he was still deep in enemy territory, and that Zack was in danger. To hell with Zack's orders. Cloud intended to stick to the other man's side like glue, if it meant the tight knot of worry in his chest would go away. Without another pause, Cloud lurched forward, secretly glad when his legs didn't collapse under him. The cure spell had helped a lot more than he thought. He ignored the shouts of the troopers at his sudden movement, easily dodging out of the way of any outstretched arms trying to catch hold of him. Despite feeling like he'd gone around with a weapon and lost, he was still fast enough that a normal human had no chance of stopping him if he didn't want to be stopped. The problem came in the fact that not all of the soldiers were normal humans, as Cloud realized when an arm caught him around the waist to hold his movement. He lashed out wildly and caught the man upside the head with an elbow. "Shit!" the man howled, his grip loosening enough for Cloud to wiggle out of it. He didn't wait to make sure the soldier was okay. He hadn't hit him that hard, and Cloud knew from experience that it took a lot more than a blow to the head to take one out. The surprise at the hit and the strength behind it had given Cloud his opportunity, and he didn't waste it. Behind him he could hear the shouts of the troopers mixed with the sound of bodies crashing through the undergrowth. Well, it wasn't Cloud's problem if they decided to follow him. He turned his attention ahead, focusing on finding where Zack had disappeared to. Branches whipped at his cheeks, and he kept a hand in front of his face to deflect the worst of the blows. He heard clothing tear, felt a sharp burn across one leg as a bush ripped through his pants. Cloud's blind charge, whether by luck or a subconscious remembrance of last night's journey, spilled him out into the sight of the Mako pool. He paused, chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath, and that was disgusting for a workout as short as that. He ignored the burning in his legs and took a few more steps into the clearing. There was a snap of twigs behind him. Cloud didn't waste a moment before diving to the ground, the slashing talon of a hippogriff narrowly missing him. If he were the type to swear, Cloud would have turned the air blue at this point. He was friends with Sid Highwind. He knew more ways to describe the improbable origins of a person than most people could even dream of. Instead, he leapt up and darted forward, eyes scanning the landscape for a branch, or if he were lucky, a discarded sword. Any weapon would do at this point, since Cloud was unsure he could keep his skin whole in close combat with one of these monsters. Behind him, the hippogriff shrieked angrily, its claws tearing into the dirt as it scrambled after him. He knew the monster was getting close, that he only had a few more seconds before it overtook him, and he'd be forced to defend himself as best he could barehanded. Tifa would have been a big help right now, he reflected. In a jumbled moment, he heard a distant shout from a human, just as he saw a glint of metal on the ground.
"Holy fucking Cloud!"
There was a heavy feeling behind him in the air, and Cloud knew the hippogriff had lunged. He dove for the discarded weapon, unsure of its exact properties, but hoping that it at least vaguely sword-shaped. Gunfire rippled through the air as his hands closed on the handle, and Cloud rolled when he hit the ground. He brought the sword up quickly, having déjà vu flashes to his fight with the dragon. At least the smaller monster couldn't swallow him whole. The weight of the creature as it landed on him drove the breath from him and caused the sword's pommel to strike the ground next to his side. His hands trapped awkwardly around it. The monster's talons drove into the ground next to his head, missing by inches. The sword very nearly cut the creature in two where Cloud had managed to skewer it. Its back was also riddled with bullet holes, and it was most certainly dead. It took a bit to heave the corpse to one side, so he could roll out from under it, but Cloud managed. As he pulled the sword free, he heard the boots pounding up behind him, a handful of troopers from before having managed to catch up to him. He ignored them for a moment, eyes taking in the weapon in his hands. At least he knew where Zack's sword had gone.
"Geez, Cloud,"
a trooper breathed, wide-eyed and pale-faced in the sunlight.
"What the hell were you thinking? Doesn't matter what he thought. It's what we should be doing now that's the problem,"
another trooper said tightly, indicating with a jerky movement of his head around the clearing. A dozen more of the hippogriffs were creeping towards them, more emerging from the cliff face in a wave of mad eyes and ruffling feathers. They hissed, beaks clacking ominously as they postured.
"Troopers, line up and provide us some cover,"
one of the soldiers ordered, as his counterpart tugged his long sword from its sheath and readied himself for battle. Their faces were grim, as if they already knew the outcome of the fight.
"Try to retreat back into the woods if you can, and make sure the idiot goes with you this time."
"No," Cloud said, voice quiet but cutting.
"The fuck are you on about, trooper? You're ill and in no condition to fight,"
the soldier snapped. He was scared. Cloud could see it in his stiff posture, and it was Cloud's fault they were in this situation at all, he realized. Instead of letting him run off like a madman he was and getting himself killed, these soldiers had taken Zack's orders to heart, following him into what appeared to be certain death. He owed it to Zack, at least, to make sure they didn't die here.
"I said no,"
he repeated, louder and more forcefully. He swung the sword sharply through the air, the flicking movement getting most of the monster gore off the blade. It wouldn't matter in a moment. He stood up as tall as his stature would allow and gave them a hard look, well versed from his travels with hard-headed and egotistical companions.
"All of you, fall back into the woods now. This is my fight. I'll provide you cover,"
he said, keeping his voice even and methodical.
"Cloud, look, you're still messed up from the Mako,"
the first trooper said.
I mean, you're not a soldier. You know that, right?"
"I know that," Cloud said quietly, ignoring the pang at the thoughtless reminder. The trooper looked relieved for a moment, though the expression was quickly wiped off his face when Cloud continued.
"But I can beat them where you would die." "Just knock him over the head and get him out of here,"
the second soldier barked. Across the clearing, the monsters started their charge, shrieking and warbling as they tore across the ground.
"Shit! Fall back! Get him out of here! He's a danger to all of us like this!"
There was no more time to argue. Cloud darted forward, bringing the sword around in a familiar arc he'd practiced many times before. He nearly lost it, and it was more than he'd forgotten the balance of Zack's old sword. His body didn't feel like his, despite the aches and pains. Still, he was too good of a swordsman to falter. The sword glowed briefly, as it resonated with his life force. Then he sent out a shockwave, in time with the follow-through of his swing. The ground was ripped up, pebbles and loose dirt flying everywhere, until the shockwave hit the first of the hippogriffs. They were thrown back with angry cries into the monsters behind them, halting the charge in one blow. "Holy shit," a trooper breathed, breaking the momentary lull.
"That only stalled them. Now get out of here,"
Cloud said, then charged forward without waiting to see if they followed his instructions. Ahead of him, the hippogriffs were fighting amongst themselves as they tried to regain their feet, beaks snapping as they hissed and rolled. Cloud didn't give them the chance to regroup, leaping up and coming down with an overhand blow with a sword that nearly severed the head of one of the monsters. His back screamed in pain as he swung his sword to the left, sinking the blade deep into the side of another creature. It wasn't a fatal blow, unfortunately, but it should keep it out of Cloud's way for a bit. He darted forward between two more lurching bodies. They collided behind him in a tangle of wings and shrieks. Another swing of his sword took care of a third attacker. Before Cloud was forced to move again, unable to remain still without being overwhelmed by attackers. Gunshot cracked through the air, just as two more bodies arrived nearby. Cloud gave the two soldiers a wide-eyed look of surprise, unable to believe they hadn't left while they'd had the chance. A glance over his shoulder allowed Cloud to see the regular troopers firing their rifles into the fray, the barrels smoking from the constant use. The fools were going to get themselves killed. "Eyes front!" a voice yelled in his ear, and Cloud had time to keep a slashing pair of talons from gutting him. A plain sword flashed by him, striking the creature between the eyes as it was driven into the monster's brain. "If you're gonna fight, do it. Otherwise fall back like you should," the soldier snarled, pulling his sword free. Cloud responded by swinging his sword at the man's head, causing him to duck the large blade. The hippogriff that had been about to close its jaws on his skull was lifted clean off the ground as Cloud used the sword to lever it up and over, throwing it into another monster. The soldier straightened and scowled at him before they were again swept into the fever of the battle. Cloud ignored the burning of the aching of his body, falling into a trance of hacking and slashing, dodging and running. When the frightened yell from one of the troopers caught his attention, he leapt high out of the fray to land in between the monster and its attempted victim. One swing knocked the hippogriff into its flank, and a second swing took care of it before it could rise. Cloud stumbled, sticking Zack's sword into the ground to catch himself as a wave of vertigo overtook him. This wasn't going to last much longer. More of the creatures were joining the battle every second, and Cloud was tiring too fast. He could save himself if he fled, but the troopers and the soldiers would be overwhelmed in short order. Even if he stayed and fought, it was unlikely Cloud would be able to protect them and keep his own skin whole. He could only pray that Zack somehow learned of their predicament and made it here in time to save the others. Overhead, a steady thumping noise had been getting louder, and he saw out of the corner of his eyes a helicopter clear the top of the cliff wall. Something electric lanced through him, dragging at him, and made him gasp. Cloud's hand clutched convulsively at the sword holding him up, even as a thrill of terror screamed through him. As if a mine had been triggered, the ground exploded. Dirt, debris, and blood from destroyed hippogriffs spurting into the air like a geyser, lengthwise across the clearing. In another part of the clearing, it happened again, this time felling several trees. A third strike, and water sprayed into the air as the stream was bisected and a part of the cliff wall sent crashing down. As the dust fell, Cloud could see deep rifts scored into the ground, decorated with bits of monster and rubble. Like something out of his nightmares, Sephiroth alighted but a few feet away, his coat swaying around him and his hair floating down as if he were weightless. It felt as if all the air had left Cloud's lungs as the man turned towards him. Green eyes flickered over him. Then, in the next second, Masamune's eerie song filled Cloud's ears. He couldn't react in time as the blade swept towards him, too paralyzed by shock and fear, and light glinted off several feet of cold steel over his shoulder, but Cloud's mind had gone blank with horror. He couldn't believe it was happening, didn't want to recognize the tall figure standing imposingly in front of him. Sword held with the careless grace that exuded from every inch of this man. Time seemed to slow, enhancing every sound, from the liquid squelch of the wounded beast behind him, to the whistle of the wind that stirred in the silver locks of his enemy's hair, to the beating of the air from the helicopter rotors above. Cloud felt like he'd lost his mind again, that he was stuck reliving the worst moment of his life in a twisted funhouse recollection, distorted from reality, but recognizable enough to be twice as terrifying. I will never be a memory. And it was true. A hysterical part of Cloud's mind gibbered. Not even a handful of months after he'd been defeated. What right did Sephiroth have to show up here, now? Didn't Cloud get at least a few years' grace before he was forced to sacrifice another chunk of his soul to the monster in front of him? Adrenaline poured into Cloud, making the Buster Sword in his hand suddenly feel as light as a cardboard tube. Sephiroth's sword was momentarily burdened with the Hippogriff's corpse, and Cloud needed every millisecond he could get if he were to defeat him once again. There was little finesse to the swing, as Cloud drove the blade for Sephiroth's side, praying that luck would be on his side just this once. Sephiroth whirled out of the way and brought Masamune up automatically to catch the sword, and for a moment they were locked together. Cloud glared desperately, wildly, over the locked blades at the man he'd spent so much time fighting. Then the deadly sword Sephiroth wielded snaked out from under the Buster Sword, and Cloud had to move swiftly to block the swift series of strikes that came his way. The entire time, Masamune seemed to croon mockingly in his ears, but the ringing of the sword was a familiar song to Cloud. Masamune was as deadly as ever, the blows coming in almost too fast for Cloud to keep up. Almost. The Buster Sword reacted to his commands, blocking the deadly length from reaching him. Sephiroth was driving him back, keeping Cloud on the defense for as long as he could. He always did, never waiting for Cloud to make the first move, only stopping to taunt when Cloud was unable to retaliate. Cloud vowed not to give Sephiroth the chance this time. While the sword dance was familiar, Sephiroth wasn't attacking at full power. He probably wanted to toy with Cloud for a while. Cloud abruptly shifted his grip on the sword, changing a defensive block into an offensive push to knock Sephiroth back. In the moment of space, he brought the blade in an underhanded sweep that caused the ground to explode in a shower of rubble. Sephiroth would dodge the shockwave one way or another. While his attention was divided, Cloud leapt over and through the concealing dust cloud, bringing the Buster Sword down in an overhead blow where he could still sense Sephiroth's presence. Cloud's sword, Zack's sword, gave a harsh metallic screech as it connected with another blade, but it wasn't the familiar ringing tones of the Masamune, a song that had become ingrained in his memory long ago. Something shattered in the dust, and Masamune sung again as a small shard of metal flew past Cloud's face, nicking it just enough to draw a line of blood. He barely felt the sting, too busy staring in stunned amazement as Zack was suddenly between him and Sephiroth. This wasn't supposed to happen. Just like Zack wasn't supposed to be alive, and neither was Sephiroth, damn it. So much was wrong, and Cloud's head was pounding in time with his heartbeat as he had nowhere to release the battle rush that had abruptly been cut short. Zack bent his knees under the pressure of the Buster Sword, which he was holding off with one of the standard long swords the soldiers wielded. A second one, shattered in two by Masamune no doubt, was in his other hand. Cloud stumbled slightly as Zack shoved back hard to get the pressure off before he turned to him.
"Oh, hey, Cloud, you found my sword."
"Zack," Sephiroth stated flatly. Across from him, Sephiroth lowered Masamune, though Cloud refused to let his guard down. Zack's cheerful comment was so incongruous to the seriousness of the moment, ignoring the very life or death balance. But what really made Cloud freeze in surprise was Sephiroth's response. There was no mocking lit to his voice, no trace of madness or the god complex that had driven the man's final moments. It was too human to be Sephiroth, and yet Cloud could see with his own eyes the truth of it.
"Sorry about that, Sephiroth. Cloud took a spill into the Mako over there, and he's been a little disorientated ever since. You know how it is. I know he's kind of intimidating, Cloud, but you don't need to attack the guy."
He didn't resist when Zack wrestled the sword out of his hand. Several puzzle pieces were finally clicking together, and the confused recollection of the past 12 hours or so resolved themselves in his mind. Zack was alive and well, and strangely unfamiliar with Cloud. Shinra troopers were still active, and there were even soldiers here, their differently colored uniforms standing out among the regular troopers. Even Aerith hadn't been right, sounding more alive than he'd ever heard her before. Sephiroth was here before him, not with a killing intent focused solely on Cloud, as if the rest of the world didn't matter, as if Cloud was the only one he wanted to see suffer. Instead, he was sane, quieter than Cloud expected, and standing with a powerful aloofness that not even the madness had erased completely. And now he was towing one of the hippogriff corpses. And Cloud could barely believe he was seeing the great general doing something so mundane. Cloud shook his head, aware that Zack's hand was a steadying weight on his shoulder, and that he had probably been trying to get his attention. Cloud could sense the stares from the few men around him, mirroring the expression he could see spread across one soldier's face. Awe, incredulity, quite a bit of terror, and his gaze was resting solely on Cloud, as if Cloud had done something inhumanly insane. Laughter bubbled up in Cloud's throat, and he was helpless to prevent the wheezing chuckles from escaping his throat. He felt raw, exposed, yet a bubble of pure hope and happiness rose up in his chest. There was only one explanation for this. He had been given a second chance for redemption. "Zack," he rasped, his voice sore from his exertions, an overwhelming emotion. "You're real!" He collapsed forward, laughter still escaping his mouth. Zack's arms were quickly around him before he could hit the ground, though if he said anything, Cloud couldn't hear it over the roaring in his own ears, surrounded by his friend's warmth, who relaxed in the knowledge that for now, everything was going to be okay.